They told you the British Empire was too big to fail. They told you the Dutch Republic was the most sophisticated financial system the world had ever seen. And they were wrong, every single time. There is a pattern to how the world's reserve currency dies. It's not a theory, it's mathematical. It's a 5-stage collapse sequence that has repeated itself with terrifying precision. The Dutch guilder followed it. The British pound followed it. And now, the US dollar is following the exact same path. We've already completed the first 4 stages. We are living in the critical window between stage 4 and the final, catastrophic stage 5. This isn't a prediction of what might happen. This is a description of what is already happening, stage by stage, just as history demands. So what is a reserve currency? It's the ultimate economic privilege. It means the entire world agrees to use your paper money to settle their most important trades, especially for essential commodities like oil. This creates an almost magical power, the ability to export your inflation. Think of it this way. If Argentina prints too many pesos, their currency becomes worthless inside Argentina. But if the United States prints trillions of dollars, the world soaks them up. For decades, countries have been forced to hold dollars to buy oil, to trade with each other, to feel secure. The global demand for dollars allows the US to live beyond its means, buying real goods from the world with pieces of paper it creates out of thin air. This is the exorbitant privilege. The Dutch established this system with the guilder in the 1600s. Their dominance was built on the Dutch East India Company, the first mega corporation, which controlled the spice trade. If you wanted spices, you needed guilders. Then the British took over. The pound sterling became the world's currency because the British Empire controlled global shipping lanes and trade routes. If you wanted to trade within the empire, you used pounds. After World War II, the United States inherited this role through the Bretton Woods Agreement, which tied the world's currencies to the dollar and the dollar to gold. When that broke down in 1971, we created an even more powerful system, the petrodollar. We made a deal with Saudi Arabia that oil would be sold only in US dollars. This forced every nation that needed oil to also need dollars, creating perpetual artificial demand. But the entire system has one critical, fatal weakness. It depends entirely on perpetual global confidence. The moment that confidence cracks, the entire privilege evaporates. And that crack is now a chasm. This is where every empire begins its currency's reign. Stage 1, the golden age of unquestioned dominance. This is the period of massive trade surpluses and absolute financial credibility. For the Dutch, this was the 17th century. Wealth didn't just flow into Amsterdam, it flooded. The Dutch East India Company was more powerful than most countries, with its own army and navy. The guilder was as good as gold because it was backed by the most powerful commercial enterprise on the planet. The world needed what the Dutch sold, and they needed guilders to buy it. For the British, the Golden Age was the Pax Britannica of the 19th and early 20th centuries. The sun never set on the British Empire, and the pound sterling was the glue that held global trade together. The pound was considered so safe, so reliable that it was effectively the world's money. Britain ran enormous trade surpluses, financing its empire with the profits from its industrial and commercial dominance. For the United States, our Golden Age was the period following World War II. Europe was in ruins. Our manufacturing base was untouched. We produced over half of the world's manufactured goods. The Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944 formally anointed the dollar as the world's reserve currency, backed by the largest gold reserves in history. The world needed American cars, American machinery, American everything, and they needed dollars to get them. The common thread in every Golden Age is the illusion of permanence. The Dutch couldn't imagine a world without the VOC. The British believed their empire was a permanent fixture of the world order. And America believed in its own exceptionalism that the dollar's dominance was a permanent reward for winning the war. But this stage always, without exception, plants the seeds of its own destruction. The immense wealth creates complacency, a sense of entitlement, and a belief that the rules of economics no longer apply. That arrogance is what makes stage 2 not just possible, but inevitable. And that arrogance leads directly to stage 2, the military overreach that breaks the economy. This is the moment the reserve nation, flush with cash and confidence, decides it can police the entire world. The massive trade surpluses of the Golden Age are no longer invested in productive capacity at home. Instead, they are funneled into destructive expenditure abroad. The economy shifts from creating wealth to projecting power, and it creates the first major irreversible crack in the system. For the Dutch, this was a series of devastating wars against England and France in the late 17th century. The Anglo-Dutch wars were fought over control of the seas and trade routes. They were phenomenally expensive, draining the Dutch treasury and diverting resources away from the commercial fleet that had built their wealth. The Dutch Republic, a small nation, was trying to fight multiple great powers at once. The cost of global dominance began to exceed its economic output. For the British Empire, the point of imperial overstretch was even clearer. The Boer War at the turn of the 20th century was a brutal, expensive conflict that revealed the limits of British power. But the fatal blow was World War I. To finance the war, Britain went deeply into debt, much of it to the United States. The war shattered the global economic order that the pound had dominated. Britain went from being the world's greatest creditor to a nation drowning in war debt. The military machine that was supposed to protect the empire instead bankrupted it. And the United States? Our military overreaches the post-9/11 era, the global war on terror, the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, the trillions of dollars spent not on building bridges and factories at home, but on building bases and funding conflicts overseas. Our defense budget dwarfs that of the next 10 countries combined. Just like the Dutch and the British, we decided that global hegemony was a necessary cost of maintaining the dollar system. But it's a cost that hollows out the domestic economy, that gives the currency its real value. We shifted from being a nation that produced goods for the world to a nation that produces debt for the Pentagon. This is the critical transition from productive investment to destructive expenditure. It's the point where the currency's foundation, a strong, productive economy, starts to erode, replaced by the illusion of strength backed by military force. And once that foundation is cracked, the only tool left to paper over the problem is the printing press. That desperation is stage 3. The military overreach of stage 2 creates a financial hole that is simply too big to fill with taxes or borrowing. The productive economy has been weakened, but the bills for global dominance keep coming due. This forces the empire to make a fateful choice: admit the limits of its power and retrench, or pull the ultimate lever. This is stage 3, the fiscal reckoning and the printing press solution. It's the moment the financial authorities abandon fiscal discipline and decide to create the money they can no longer earn or borrow. For the Dutch, this reckoning came as their crown jewel, the Dutch East India Company, began its long, slow decline. The company that had built their empire became a bloated, inefficient bureaucracy. To keep it afloat and finance their wars, the Dutch Republic turned to complex financial engineering. They issued more and more debt, effectively creating money to sustain an enterprise that was no longer profitable. They were trying to paper over a fundamental decline in their real economic power. For the British, the moment of truth arrived in 1931. The strain of World War I, debt, and the Great Depression shattered the foundation of the pound's credibility, the gold standard. Britain could no longer honor its commitment to exchange pounds for gold at the fixed rate. So they abandoned it. This was the first great monetary reset. The pound was cut loose from its anchor, becoming what we now call a fiat currency. It was an admission that the empire's financial promises could no longer be backed by real, tangible assets. For the United States, our Nixon shock came in 1971. Just like Britain 40 years earlier, foreign governments were lining up to exchange their dollars for American gold. The U.S. no longer had enough gold to honor those claims. So, President Nixon unilaterally closed the gold window. The dollar became a pure fiat currency, backed by nothing but the full faith and credit of the United States government. This was the point of no return. But that was just the beginning. The true printing press solution accelerated after the 2008 financial crisis. The Federal Reserve launched a policy called quantitative easing. In simple terms, they created trillions of dollars out of thin air to buy government debt and mortgage bonds. They did it again during the COVID-19 pandemic, on an even more massive scale. The Fed's balance sheet exploded from under $1 trillion to nearly $9 trillion. This is debt monetization on a scale the Dutch and British couldn't have even imagined. It's the ultimate admission that the real economy cannot support the nation's spending. The printing press becomes the only tool left, transforming the central bank from a guardian of currency stability into a financing mechanism for perpetual deficits. Once this genie is out of the bottle, it cannot be put back. This policy creates a fundamental, irreversible shift in the global perception of the currency. It signals that the nation is no longer a creditor to the world, but is becoming its largest debtor. And this reliance on the printing press marks the most critical and most dangerous transition in the entire collapse pattern. This is the point where the reserve nation officially flips from being a creditor nation to a debtor nation. It's a seismic shift in the global financial order, and it signals the end of the currency's perceived safety. The nation that once funded the world is now begging the world to fund its lifestyle. The Netherlands made this transition as their trade profits from the Golden Age dwindled. They shifted from earning vast wealth from their global enterprises to relying more and more on financial speculation and banking. The real, tangible wealth coming into the country was replaced by paper profits and debt instruments. They went from owning the world's most valuable assets to being financiers for others. For Britain, this transition was stark and humiliating. Before World War I, Britain was the world's banker, lending massive sums to countries like the United States to build their infrastructure. By the end of World War II, the situation was completely reversed. Britain was drowning in debt, primarily to the United States. In 1976, the decline became undeniable to the entire world when the British government was forced to go to the International Monetary Fund, hat in hand, to ask for an emergency loan to support the pound. The world's former banker was now a supplicant. The United States has followed this exact same path. For most of our history, we were a creditor nation. The world owed us money, but starting in the 1980s, that began to change. Today, the United States is the world's largest debtor nation by a staggering margin. Our national debt now exceeds our entire annual economic output. We rely on countries like Japan and China to continuously buy our treasury bonds to fund our government's operations. This is the mathematical impossibility that signals the end of reserve status. How can a currency be the world's safest asset when the nation issuing it is the world's largest debtor? The answer is it can't. The perception of safety was a temporary illusion, propped up by the petrodollar system and military dominance. But once a nation becomes a net debtor, the incentive for the rest of the world changes. Holding that nation's debt is no longer an investment in a growing, productive economy. It becomes a geopolitical risk. The global financial system starts looking for the exit, and that search for an alternative is what defines the next and most urgent stage. The search for an exit brings us to the stage we are living through right now. Stage 4, the trade bypass. This is not a future prediction. It is a current, accelerating reality. When the world loses confidence in the stability and neutrality of the reserve currency, it doesn't just sit and wait for the collapse. It begins building alternative systems. It finds ways to conduct critical trade that explicitly bypass the currency it no longer trusts. We have the historical playbook for this, and we are watching it unfold in real time. For the Dutch, the bypass came from rising mercantile powers. As the Dutch Republic was weakened by war and financial strain, England and France began challenging its trade monopolies. They built their own powerful navies and trading companies. They started conducting more and more of their own trade directly in their own currencies or through barter arrangements, cutting out the Dutch middleman and their guilders. The system started to fragment. For the British pound, the most dramatic public moment of the bypass was the Suez Crisis of 1956. Britain, along with France and Israel, invaded Egypt to regain control of the Suez Canal. In response, the United States, worried about Soviet influence, launched a devastating financial attack. They threatened to sell its holdings of British government bonds, which would have crashed the pound. To avoid a currency collapse, Britain was forced into a humiliating withdrawal. The world saw that the pound was no longer a truly independent global currency. It was now vulnerable to American pressure. It was a public demonstration that the old master was now subordinate to the new one. Today, the United States is facing its own Suez crisis, but it's happening in slow motion and on a global scale. The weaponization of the dollar through sanctions, freezing Russia's reserves, cutting banks off from SWIFT, was a catastrophic strategic error from the perspective of reserve currency longevity. It told every other major power, including nominal allies, that their dollar assets are not safe. It demonstrated that the U.S. is willing to use the global financial system as a weapon. And so, the bypass has begun in earnest. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are the obvious architects. But it's not just them. They are actively creating alternative payment systems to bypass both the dollar and the U.S.-controlled SWIFT network. China has its cross-border interbank payment system, CIPS. Russia has the System for Transfer of Financial Messages, SPFS. These are the plumbing for a new financial architecture. More importantly, we are seeing the direct bypass of the dollar in essential commodity trades. The cornerstone of the petrodollar system is cracking. China is now buying oil and gas from Russia, Iran, and Saudi Arabia using yuan, and increasingly using their own currencies in bilateral deals. Saudi Arabia has officially joined the China-led BRICS bloc and is openly discussing pricing oil and other currencies. This is not a minor shift. It is an attack on the fundamental engine of dollar demand. Simultaneously, central banks around the world are engaged in a historic accumulation of gold. They are buying gold at a pace not seen since the Bretton Woods era. Why? Because gold is the ultimate neutral asset. It's an asset that cannot be sanctioned, frozen, or devalued by the Federal Reserve. This move into gold is a silent vote of no confidence. It is the financial equivalent of building a lifeboat. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is happening in plain sight, documented in trade agreements and central bank reports. The trade bypass is the most dangerous phase for the incumbent currency because it is self-reinforcing. Every bilateral deal that avoids the dollar makes the dollar a little less necessary for the next deal. The momentum builds quietly at first and then all at once. We are no longer at the beginning of stage 4. The evidence suggests we are in its advanced stages, approaching the final trigger that will push the system into its terminal phase. And here's the critical detail that history shows always speeds up this process: the weaponization of the currency. Using your financial power as a geopolitical cudgel doesn't just signal weakness. It actively accelerates the flight from your currency. It turns a slow, managed decline into a rapid, chaotic unraveling. The sanctions against Russia were not just a policy decision. They were a massive real-time experiment that demonstrated to the entire world the inherent risk of holding dollar-based assets. You can follow every rule, you can be a neutral party, but if the United States decides it doesn't like your government, it can, with the stroke of a pen, freeze or seize the reserves you have stored in its financial system. This transforms the dollar from the world's safest asset into its largest potential liability. Think about it from the perspective of China, India, or Saudi Arabia. They watched as Russia's access to hundreds of billions of dollars was severed. The message was unmistakable. Your assets are only safe until they aren't. This wasn't a theoretical risk anymore. It was a live demonstration. So what is the rational response? It's to reduce your exposure. It's to build alternative payment channels that are outside of American control. The development of systems like China's CIPS and Russia's SPFS didn't start with the Ukraine war, but the war poured jet fuel on their development and adoption. Countries that might have been hesitant are now actively participating, not necessarily out of ideological alignment with Russia or China, but out of pure pragmatic self-interest. They are diversifying away from a system that has proven it can be used against them. This is the self-inflicted wound that historical precedents warn against. When Britain used its financial power to pressure other nations, it only worked as long as those nations had no alternative. The moment an alternative emerged, the US dollar, the British leverage evaporated. The United States is now making the exact same mistake, but on a global scale and at a much faster pace. We are actively incentivizing the creation of the very system that will replace us. Every new sanction, every threat of asset seizure, is another brick in the wall of a new parallel financial world. The weaponization of the dollar is the single greatest accelerant pushing us from stage 4 directly into the final catastrophic stage, which brings us to the final, inevitable stage. Stage 5, the internal implosion. This is where the collapse comes home. For decades, the United States has been able to export the negative consequences of its money printing. The inflation created by the Federal Reserve's trillions was absorbed by the global demand for dollars. But once the trade bypass of stage 4 reaches a critical mass, that dynamic reverses. The world stops soaking up the excess dollars. The inflation that was once exported around the globe floods back into the American economy. Stage 5 is not an attack from a foreign power. It is the mathematical certainty of inflation returning to its source. We have the historical blueprints for this final act. For the Dutch, the implosion was a long, grinding decline. As the guilder lost its global role, the immense wealth of the Dutch Golden Age evaporated. Amsterdam went from being the financial center of the world to a regional hub. The standard of living that had been built on global trade profits slowly but surely contracted. The inflation that had been exported to their trading partners finally manifested at home, eroding the savings and purchasing power of ordinary citizens. For the British, the final stage was more dramatic. The sterling crisis of 1967 forced a humiliating 14.3% devaluation of the pound. But the true internal implosion came a decade later in the 1970s. This period, culminating in the winter of discontent in 1978-79, was a textbook example of stage 5. Rampant inflation, soaring unemployment, and widespread labor strikes brought the country to a standstill. The government was forced to go to the International Monetary Fund for a bailout. The nation that had once ruled a quarter of the globe was now unable to manage its own economy. The pound's loss of reserve status wasn't just a foreign affairs issue, it resulted in a severe, painful decline in the British standard of living. The illusion of imperial grandeur was replaced by the grim reality of economic stagnation and social unrest. This is what awaits the United States. The final stage is always a domestic crisis. It's the moment the music stops. The global demand for treasury bonds dries up as countries no longer need to hold vast dollar reserves. To fund its massive deficits, the U.S. government will have only one buyer left, the Federal Reserve. The Fed will be forced to monetize the debt on a scale that makes the post-2008 era look trivial. This is the direct path to hyperinflation. The dollars that were once held by foreign central banks will flood back into the U.S. financial system, chasing a finite amount of goods and services. Prices for everything, food, energy, housing, will spiral out of control. The key thing to understand is that this is not a political problem with a political solution. It is a mathematical problem. The sheer weight of the debt, combined with the loss of the exorbitant privilege, creates an inescapable gravitational pull toward devaluation. The only question is the form it takes. It could be an official devaluation, a reset, where the government introduces a new digital dollar and revalues the old one. It could be an uncontrolled spiral into Weimar Republic-style hyperinflation, but the outcome is the same, a catastrophic loss of purchasing power for anyone holding US dollars. The empire's final act is not a foreign invasion. It's the grocery bill becoming unpayable, the life savings becoming worthless, and the social contract tearing apart under the strain. The pattern is locked in. The only variable now is the speed of the transition from stage 4 to stage 5. So if this pattern is so inevitable, what survives? What preserved wealth when the guilder collapsed and the pound took over? What worked when the pound collapsed and the dollar rose? The historical record is brutally clear. During these seismic shifts, paper claims on the failing empire become worthless, while tangible, productive assets preserve real value. When the Dutch system crumbled, the people who kept their wealth weren't the ones holding guilder-denominated bonds. They were the ones who owned land, productive businesses outside of the declining core, and most importantly, gold and silver. The same pattern held for the British collapse. As the pound was devalued, the assets that held their value were not sterling deposits. They were equities in growing American companies, real estate in stable jurisdictions, and, again, gold. The key distinction is between nominal value and real value. Your bank account might show the same number of dollars, pounds, or guilders, but if that currency buys a fraction of what it used to, you have experienced a catastrophic loss. The assets that survive are the ones that are not someone else's liability. A share in a profitable company, a piece of farmland that produces food, a bar of gold, these things have intrinsic value that transcends the fate of any single currency. Geographic diversification becomes absolutely critical. Wealth that is solely tied to the geography of the collapsing empire gets wiped out. The money that moved from Europe to the United States in the early 20th century preserved its value. The money that stayed often did not. The transition from stage 4 to stage 5 is not a silent event. History gives us clear signals, the final tremors before the earthquake. For the guilder, it was the acceleration of trade deals between England and France that explicitly excluded Dutch merchants. For the pound, the unmistakable signal was the 1956 Suez Crisis, a public demonstration that the UK's financial stability was now dependent on American permission. We are seeing the modern equivalents right now, and they are accelerating. The most critical signal is the loss of the petrodollar monopoly. Any major long-term oil contract signed in yuan, rubles, or rupees is a direct signal. The expansion of the BRICS bloc to include major energy producers like Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the UAE is another. The timeline for this final stage is not linear. It moves slowly until it doesn't. Once a critical mass of countries decides the risk of holding dollars outweighs the benefit, the exit will happen all at once. We are in that acceleration phase now. The point of recognition, where the mainstream financial world admits the dollar's dominance is over, will come long after the point of no return has already been passed. The signals are not hiding. They are in every central bank gold purchase report, in every bilateral trade agreement that bypasses the SWIFT system. We are watching the final countdown in real time. The 5-stage collapse pattern is not a theory. It is historical fact, repeated with mathematical precision. The United States is not approaching this path. We are 4/5 of the way through it. The pattern doesn't care about American exceptionalism. The only variable now is the speed of the final descent into stage 5. The answers to what happens next aren't hiding in the future. They are written in the past, in the collapse of the guilder and the devaluation of the pound. If this has changed how you see the stability of the global financial system, you need to understand what comes next.